All right, welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today we're going to be doing something a little different.
Oh,
Yeah, today we're tackling a figure who's, well, let's just say he's known more for who his students were than for his own philosophical output.
I see. A bit of a behind-the-scenes influencer of the ancient world. Someone whose impact was more indirect.
Exactly. We're talking about Philo of Larissa.
Philo. Last head of the academy, right? Well, at least the last one we have solid information on. And yeah, most famous now for being Cicero's teacher.
Precisely. And that connection is hugely important because it's through Cicero that a lot of the skeptical ideas from Plato's Academy made their way into the Roman world and, let's face it, influenced Western thought for centuries.
No small feat. So are we using Cicero as our main source then?
Actually, no. Cicero's Academic is helpful, but for Philo himself, we're going to be relying mostly on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Makes sense. Solid secondary source. So what's our mission today? To understand Philo's own philosophy, despite the fact that so little of his own writing survives.
You got it. We want to unpack how his views on knowledge, on what we can actually know, changed over time. And to do that, we need to understand his relationship with both skepticism and Platonism.
Two of the big heavy hitters in ancient Greek philosophy. This Philo guy must have been swimming in some deep intellectual waters.
He was.
Right.
And the whole time, he's grappling with these fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, the role of reason, and how we should live our lives. Questions that, let's be honest, are still relevant to anyone trying to understand the world today.
All right, you've piqued my interest. Let's get into it. Where do we begin? A little background on Philo himself, perhaps?
Absolutely. So Philo was born in Larissa.
Hold on, Larissa, where's that again?
It's in Thessaly, a region in ancient Greece. Anyway, he was born sometime around 1598 BCE.
Got it. Ancient Greece, pre-Roman takeover. What do we know about his early life, his education?
Well, what we do know is that he had a pretty solid philosophical upbringing. For 8 years, he studied under a philosopher named Callicles.
Callicles rings a bell. Wasn't he a student of someone famous?
You got it. Callicles was a student of Carneades.
So Philo's already got these skeptical influences from early on.
Exactly. And that influence deepens when he moves to Athens, around 1343 BCE.
Athens, of course, the philosophical hub. Did he head straight for the academy then?
He did, and he spent a good 14 years there studying with Clitomachus.
Another big name in skepticism. And wait, wasn't Clitomachus the head of the academy at the time?
He was. So Philo's learning from one of the most influential skeptical thinkers of the era. And get this, he becomes Clitomachus's successor as scholarch, the head of the academy, in 1109 BCE.
So he basically inherited the skeptical mantle. Talk about following in some giant footsteps.
No kidding. But his time at the helm wasn't exactly smooth sailing. He had to deal with some major shakeups, philosophical disagreements, and even political turmoil.
Seems dramatic. Give me the details.
Well, first off, 2 of his own students decide to break away and start their own philosophical schools.
Philosophical infighting. That's never good for unity. Who are these students?
One was Antiochus of Ascalon. He wanted to revive what he considered the Old Academy, a more dogmatic version of Platonism that rejected all that skeptical stuff.
So, going back to the roots, huh? What about the other student?
That was in Isidemus. He goes in a completely different direction, either founding or reviving Pyrrhonism.
Pyrrhonism. That's like super skepticism, right? Even more radical than what was happening at the academy.
Exactly. So you got Philo in the middle of all this philosophical upheaval, trying to hold the academy together.
Oof. Must have been a lot of pressure. And it wasn't just philosophical infighting, right? You mentioned political problems, too.
Right. Around the same time, Athens is facing civil unrest and the looming threat of the Mithridatic Wars.
Not a great time to be a philosopher just chilling in Athens.
Not at all. This leads many of the academics, including Philo, to relocate. Philo himself ends up in Rome around 898 BCE.
Okay, so a forced relocation to Rome. Did that affect his philosophy, do you think?
It might have. It's in Rome that he writes and publishes his Roman books.
Roman books, huh? Catchy title. What were those all about?
Well, that's part of the puzzle we're trying to solve today. The problem is, none of Philo's actual writings have survived intact.
Bummer. So how do we know anything about his philosophy?
We have fragments, secondary accounts, a summary of his ethical teachings.
It's like trying to piece together a vase from a few shards.
Exactly. And that's what makes figuring out his philosophical development so tricky, so controversial.
All right, lay it on me. What's the big debate about Philo's philosophy?
The big debate is this. How did his views on knowledge change over time? Scholars pretty much agree that his views evolved after he became the head of the academy, sometime between 1109 BCE and 88 BCE, when he wrote the Roman books.
Okay, so some kind of shift happened, but what kind of shift?
That's the million-dollar question. Did his position change before he wrote the Roman books? And what exactly was the position he laid out in those books?
I'm starting to see why this is such a puzzle. So many unknowns.
Right. And to make things even more complex, you have to remember the philosophical atmosphere Philo walked into when he first arrived in Athens.
Remind me, there was a big debate going on within the academy.
Right, exactly. The big debate was about the legacy of Carneades.
Carneades. Ah, yes, the skeptic. What was the debate about? Exactly.
Well, on one side you had Cleomachus, Philo's teacher. He believed that Carneades was a radical skeptic, meaning he thought it was basically impossible to know anything for sure.
Makes sense. Fits with what we know about Carneades. But there was another side to this debate, wasn't there?
Yep. On the other side, you had a philosopher named Mithridates of Stratonicia. He argued for a more toned-down version of skepticism, something we now call mitigated skepticism.
Mitigated skepticism. So, still skeptical, but not as hardcore.
Exactly. It's the idea that, okay, maybe we can't have absolute certainty, but we can still have reasonable beliefs based on what seems most probable.
I see. So a bit more practical, a bit less, we know nothing.
Right. And when Philo takes over as scholar, he is initially seen as part of that more radical Clitomachian camp. But then, boom, the Roman books come out, and everyone's like, wait, what? This is totally new.
So the Roman books are where this big philosophical shift really becomes apparent.
It seems that way. And that's why scholars have come up with all these different theories about how Philo's views developed. Some think he went from radical skepticism to mitigated skepticism. Others say he jumped straight to Fallibilism or even back to Platonism. And then there are those who think it was a two-step process, radical to mitigated, and then either to Fallibilism or Platonism.
Okay, so a lot of possibilities on the table. How do we make sense of all this?
Well, Cicero, in his Academica, hints that Philo actually held three distinct positions throughout his career. He talks about the radical skepticism of Clitomachus, then mentions a mitigated skepticism held by some academics who disagreed with the Roman books, and then finally the position in the Roman books themselves.
So 3 phases. Interesting. Can we map those onto Philo's life in a way that makes sense?
I think we can. It seems pretty likely that Philo started out as a radical skeptic, following in Clitomachus's footsteps. Then, sometime in the 90s BCE, before going to Rome, he shifts to mitigated skepticism.
Makes sense. He was buddies with Mithridates, right? They were both seen as proponents of that view.
Exactly. And then, bam, the Roman books introduce his final and most innovative position.
Okay, so we've got a possible timeline, but what were these different positions and why the changes?
Well, to really grasp that, we need to dive into the main philosophical battleground of the time, the academics versus the Stoics.
Ah, yes, the skeptics and the dogmatists. Classic showdown.
Right. And the key point here is that all of Philo's positions, even as they evolve, share one thing in common. They all reject the Stoic conception of knowledge.
Okay, so to understand Philo, we need to understand what the Stoics were saying and why he disagreed.
Exactly. So let's break down Stoic epistemology a bit.
All right, Stoic epistemology 101. Hit me with it.
Well, the Stoics were all about achieving this unshakable guaranteed knowledge. They believed in a sort of internal truth detector that would tell us what's real and what's not.
Sounds convenient. How do they think this worked?
Their whole system had 3 main parts. First, they believed that knowledge starts with impressions. These are basically our initial perceptions of the world, the raw data coming in through our senses.
Okay, so impressions first. What then?
Then comes the tricky part. The Stoics claimed that some impressions are special. They're what they called cognitive or cataleptic.
Cognitive meaning what? Truthful.
More like self-warranting. The Stoics believe that these impressions are so clear, so distinct, that they can't possibly be false. They're like a direct grasp of reality, according to them.
Ah, so a built-in guarantee of truth. Handy, but is it realistic?
That's exactly what the academics questioned. But let's finish the Stoic picture first. Their third point was that true knowledge is based solely on these cognitive impressions. So for them to have knowledge is to have a belief that's rooted in a guaranteed, can't-be-wrong impression.
So they had this whole elaborate system built on this idea of a perfect truth detector.
They did. And it also tied into their view of rationality. For them, to be rational meant avoiding any belief based on a non-cognitive impression. Basically, avoid opinions and errors.
So if you stick to your cognitive impressions, you're golden. You've got knowledge and therefore happiness.
That was the idea, at least. But Philo and the other academics weren't buying it.
So how did they attack this Stoic fortress of knowledge?
Well, their main line of attack was against the whole concept of the cognitive impression. Remember, the Stoics described it as an impression that perfectly mirrors reality, super clear and distinct, impossible to mistake for a false one.
Right, and they thought this was guaranteed by its super detailed nature, right? Like, it had to be true because it was so vivid.
Exactly. But the academics said, hang on a minute, what about dreams, illusions, or even just looking at identical twins?
Oh, I see what they're getting at. You can have these really vivid, detailed experiences that are totally false.
Right, so how could you ever tell? Just based on how an impression feels, whether it's actually reflecting reality or not.
So that self-warranting aspect, that supposed guarantee of truth, the academics are saying it's just not there.
Exactly. And if you take that away, if there's no such thing as a truly cognitive impression, then the whole Stoic system starts to crumble.
Because if there are no cognitive impressions, and if the wise person avoids opinions, then
Then the wise person would never assent to anything. They'd be stuck in a state of perpetual doubt.
a recipe for not getting much done.
Right. And this leads to another problem the Stoics raised, which really put the pressure on the academics.
Lay it on me. What was the Stoic counterattack?
It's the inactivity objection. The Stoics basically said, look, if you guys are right, and we can never know anything for sure, then action becomes impossible.
Because you can't act without believing something, right?
Exactly. The Stoics argued that any intentional action, any choice we make, presupposes that we have some belief about the world.
So if the academics are right, we'd all be frozen in place, unable to do anything. Which seems pretty absurd, given that we obviously do act and make choices all the time.
Right. It's a powerful objection. And it forced the academics to come up with some clever responses.
And these responses actually map onto the different positions Philo held throughout his career, didn't they?
They do. And it all starts with radical skepticism, the position associated with Clitomachus, Philo's teacher.
Let's go back to radical skepticism then. I'm assuming this is where Philo begins his philosophical journey.
Yes. Now, it's important to remember that Carneades himself, the OG skeptic, may not have actually believed that knowledge was impossible.
Oh, so his skepticism was more of a debating tactic.
It might have been. A lot of his arguments rely on accepting Stoic premises, which he might not have actually agreed with. Plus, the whole method of the academy was to argue both sides of an issue, to test ideas through debate.
So it was more about poking holes in other people's dogmas than about establishing his own.
Exactly. But Clitomachus, his student, takes things a bit further. He interprets Carneades as saying that it's irrational to assent to anything less than absolute certainty.
So basically, if you can't be 100% sure about something, you shouldn't believe it. Which, of course, leads to the conclusion that you can't really believe in anything.
Right. And that's the hardcore version of radical skepticism that Philo starts out with.
But how did Clitomachus deal with that inactivity objection? How did he explain how a radical skeptic can still act in the world?
He had two main arguments. First, he said we can still distinguish between our thoughts based on how persuasive they are without needing to claim they're objectively true.
Persuasive, meaning what exactly? Like how convincing they are?
Right. He draws on this idea of persuasive impressions that Carneades talked about. The idea is that in our daily lives, we naturally find some impressions more convincing than others.
Based on what? Just gut feeling?
Not exactly. It's about things like how clear and vivid the impression is, the circumstances in which we get it, and how well it fits with our other beliefs.
So we act on what seems most probable, most convincing, given our current understanding.
Exactly. But Clitomachus was very careful to say that this persuasiveness never guarantees truth. Because, as the academics always pointed out, a false impression can be just as persuasive as a true one.
Okay, so we're not talking about knowledge here, just about what seems most likely. What was his second argument?
His second argument was about the nature of assent itself. He argued that the Stoics were wrong to think that assent just means believing something is true.
Because we do a lot of things without consciously thinking about whether they're true or not, right?
Exactly. Carneades had already pointed out that many of our actions are habitual, almost automatic. Or we act on things even when we have some doubts.
Like when you hit the snooze button even though you know you should get up.
Exactly. So Clitomachus takes this idea and develops it further. He makes this distinction between assenting to something and approving of it.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference between assenting and approving?
Assenting means accepting something as definitely true. Approving means accepting it as if it were true for practical purposes, even if you have some doubts.
So, like, a radical skeptic could approve of a persuasive impression, act on it without actually fully assenting to it, without fully believing it.
Precisely. He called this a practical criterion, a way to navigate the world without claiming to have absolute knowledge.
Clever. So they're not just saying, we can't know anything, so let's just sit here and do nothing.
Not at all. They're saying we can act on what seems most probable, even if we can't be certain about it.
And this applied not just to everyday life, but to philosophy as well, right?
Exactly. Cleitomachus argued that the radical skeptic can engage in philosophical debate, develop arguments, without actually holding those arguments as absolute truths. They find them persuasive, but they're not dogmatically committed to them.
So a very nuanced approach to skepticism, and this is where Philo starts out.
It is. But as with many philosophical positions, there are internal tensions, challenges that need to be addressed. And that leads us to the next stage in Philo's journey: mitigated skepticism.
So this is where he starts to move away from that hardcore, we can't know anything stance.
Exactly. And it's partly driven by this alternative interpretation of Carneades' response to that inactivity objection we talked about.
Remind me, how did that go again?
Well, remember, the Stoics said, if you can't know anything, you can't act. And Carneades seems to have replied that it is sometimes rational to assent to non-cognitive impressions.
So to act on something, even if you don't have absolute certainty.
Right. Now, some folks, like Metrodorus, took this to mean that Carneades wasn't a radical skeptic after all.
He wasn't saying we shouldn't ever believe anything. He was just saying that absolute knowledge is impossible.
Exactly. And Philo, it seems, comes to agree with this interpretation.
Okay, so Philo's moving towards this mitigated skepticism. What's pushing him in that direction?
Well, our sources don't give us all the details, but we can get some clues from how mitigated skeptics understood that idea of persuasive impressions.
Those impressions that guide our actions, even if they don't guarantee truth.
Right. Now, Philo's student Antiochus, he later criticized some academics for treating these persuasive impressions as a criterion of truth.
Meaning they weren't just using them as guides for action, they were actually seeing them as evidence for what's likely to be true.
Exactly. And it seems this is what Philo and the other mitigated skeptics were doing. They believed that making an impression more persuasive by examining it carefully, considering its context and so on, that this actually gave you some evidence, some reason to believe it might be true.
So they're starting to shift from simply suspending judgment to actually forming beliefs, even if those beliefs are tentative.
Precisely. And this applied not just to impressions from our senses, but also to philosophical ideas.
So they'd engage in these debates, arguing both sides of an issue, and then form a belief based on which side seemed more persuasive.
Exactly. That method of arguing on either side, which the radical skeptics used primarily as a critical tool, now becomes a way of actually building beliefs.
Fascinating. So they're still using that core academic method, but they're putting it to a different use.
Right. And you can see why this shift might have happened. To many people, radical skepticism just seemed too extreme.
Like giving up on reason altogether.
Right. Even if you accept that we can't be absolutely certain about anything, it still seems reasonable to form the best possible beliefs based on the evidence we have.
Because otherwise, how do you make any decisions? How do you live your life?
Exactly. And especially when it comes to ethics, you need some beliefs to guide your actions.
So Philo and the mitigated skeptics, they formalize this idea. Knowledge in the absolute sense might be impossible, but it's still rational to form beliefs when we have good reasons.
Right. They still called these beliefs opinions, not knowledge, to emphasize that they weren't claiming absolute certainty.
So a sort of humble knowledge, a recognition that we can't know for sure, but we can still have justified beliefs.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, the mitigated skeptics' own belief, their beliefs that nothing can be known for sure, was based on their arguments against the Stoics.
So they're using Stoic ideas to argue against Stoic conclusions. That's pretty ironic.
It is, which highlights a key point. Even as they reject Stoic epistemology, the mitigated skeptics are still operating within that same basic framework.
You're still talking about impressions, about reason and evidence. They're just tweaking the conclusions.
Exactly. And that reliance on the Stoic framework might be part of what leads Philo to his final position. But first, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll explore Philo's most radical move, Fallibilism.
Sounds good. I'm eager to hear how this all unfolds.
Greg.
Welcome back. Now, before the break, we were talking about Philo's move towards mitigated skepticism.
Right, the idea that we can have rational beliefs even without absolute certainty.
Exactly. But it turns out this position wasn't without its problems. And some of those problems were pointed out by Philo's own student, Antiochus.
The same Antiochus who broke away and started the old academy. The one and only. And remember, this is all happening before the Roman books come out. Antiochus is already criticizing Philo's mitigated skepticism.
What were his criticisms?
Well, he basically said that mitigated skepticism is trying to have it both ways.
How so?
On the one hand, it allows you to accept persuasive impressions as good enough evidence for practical action and even for teaching ethics.
Right, because you can't always wait for absolute certainty in those areas.
Exactly. But on the other hand, mitigated skepticism still maintains that even our best efforts at reasoning can lead us to error.
So it's like saying, sure, use your reason, but don't trust it too much.
Right. And Antiochus argued that this creates an inherent instability.
Like a philosophical tightrope walk? Hard to maintain that balance.
Precisely. And this is where the Roman books come in. Philo's response to Antiochus's criticism is to completely shake up the game.
Okay, so what's this revolutionary move?
He basically argues that the Stoic definition of a cognitive impression, the very definition that the academics have been using to argue against knowledge, is actually what makes knowledge impossible.
Whoa, so he's turning the tables on the Stoics, using their own definition against them.
Exactly. He's saying, look, if we stick with this super strict definition of knowledge, then yeah, nothing can be known, but we do know things, so that definition must be wrong.
Bold move. So what does he offer as an alternative?
Unfortunately, we don't have all the details, but we can piece together some of it from Antiochus's criticisms. It seems that Philo proposes a much weaker, more realistic definition of knowledge.
Give me the rundown. What's Philo's new definition?
He basically takes the Stoic definition and strips it down to the essentials. He says that to have knowledge, you need an impression that's true and that's caused in the right way so that it accurately represents what it's supposed to.
Okay, sounds reasonable enough. What's the catch?
The catch is that he gets rid of that third part, that requirement for the impression to be super vivid and detailed and totally self-guaranteeing.
Ah, so he's getting rid of that idea that we need absolute certainty to have knowledge.
Exactly. And this has huge implications.
I bet. It's like he's taking the whole skeptical project in a completely new direction.
He is. And this is what leads some people to call him the founder of the Fourth Academy.
A new era in skepticism. But what exactly are the implications of this new definition of knowledge?
Well, first of all, it means Philo is embracing what we call fallibilism.
Fallibilism, the idea that we can be wrong even when we think we know something.
Exactly. He's saying that just because we could be mistaken doesn't mean we don't actually have knowledge.
So he's challenging that age-old idea that true knowledge has to be absolutely certain.
Exactly. And second, it means that he's no longer saying that nothing can be known. He's saying, actually, we know quite a lot of stuff.
A pretty big departure from skepticism as it was traditionally understood.
It is. And it also leads to a change in how he thinks about rationality. Remember, the mitigated skeptics were all about being super cautious, always qualifying their beliefs.
Right, always admitting that they could be wrong.
But Philo's saying that it's actually rational to give our full assent to things, even if we could theoretically be mistaken. He's saying that the mere possibility of error doesn't invalidate our knowledge.
So a much more confident, less hesitant approach to knowledge.
Right. And this is a huge departure from both the Stoics and the earlier academics, who were both obsessed with avoiding error.
So Philo's not just tweaking the system, he's proposing a whole new way of thinking about knowledge and rationality.
He is. But, and this is a big but.
There's always a but in philosophy.
Isn't there? He's still trying to stay within the academic tradition. He doesn't want to completely abandon skepticism.
So how does he square this new, more confident view of knowledge with his academic roots?
It seems he does it by limiting the scope of this new knowledge. He's not saying that we can have absolute knowledge about everything.
What kind of knowledge is he talking about then?
He seems to be focusing on what we might call ordinary knowledge, the kind of knowledge we gain from everyday experience.
Like knowing that fire is hot or that the sun rises in the east?
Exactly. He's probably not saying that we can have this kind of certain knowledge about big philosophical questions.
So he's carving out a space for a more modest, practical kind of knowledge, while still acknowledging the limits of human reason when it comes to the big mysteries of the universe.
Precisely. And this is all part of his attempt to redefine the academy, not by a specific set of beliefs, but by his commitment to a particular method.
That method of arguing on either side, of constantly questioning and testing ideas.
Exactly. And this emphasis on method is really central to Philo's whole approach to philosophy, not just in epistemology, but also in his teaching and in his views on ethics.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit then. Tell me about Philo's views on education. How did he put this method into practice?
Well, he was a big believer in the power of debate to help students develop their own critical thinking skills.
So not just lecturing at them, but getting them to actively engage in arguments.
Exactly. And not just any arguments, but arguments where they had to consider both sides of an issue.
Because that forces you to think more deeply, to really examine the evidence.
Right. And Philo was also very strict about sticking to rational arguments. He didn't want his students to be swayed by things like emotional appeals or the speaker's reputation.
So no fancy rhetoric or appeals to authority allowed?
Nope. He wanted them to focus on the logic of the arguments themselves.
Sounds like a tough but rewarding teacher.
He was. And he went even further. He and his followers, folks like Charmadas and Cicero, they'd often deliberately hide their own opinions during debates
Why would they do that?
to encourage their students to think for themselves. They wanted them to evaluate the arguments based on their own merits, not on what their teacher believed.
A truly Socratic approach.
It is, and it really reflects that deep commitment to critical inquiry that was at the heart of the academy.
Okay, so we've got Philo's epistemology, his views on education. What about his ethics? What did he think about how we should live?
Well, that's where things get a bit tricky again. The main source we have for his ethics is a summary by Stobaeus, and it paints a bit of a strange picture.
Strange in what way?
Well, it makes him sound very dogmatic, like he's laying down a set of rules for how to be good.
That doesn't sound very skeptical.
Right. It talks about this three-part system for ethical teaching. First, you motivate people to study philosophy, then you correct their false beliefs, and then you show them how to live a good life.
Okay, so it sounds like a pretty structured approach. But you're saying it doesn't quite fit with what we know about Philo.
Exactly. The emphasis on rules and fixed principles just doesn't seem to match up with his skeptical tendencies.
So how do we reconcile this apparent contradiction?
Well, our source suggests that this summary might be a bit misleading. We don't know exactly how Philo actually taught ethics, and it's likely that he used that same method of arguing on either side.
So instead of just telling his students what to believe, he'd present them with different ethical arguments and let them work it out for themselves.
Exactly. And remember, we know he did this kind of thing in his work on rhetoric.
Because rhetoric is all about persuasion, about arguing for different positions.
Right. And there are even hints within the Stobaeus summary that suggest a more nuanced approach. It talks about correcting falsely acquired beliefs, which implies that there's room for different perspectives.
So it's not about imposing one set of beliefs, but about helping students to critically examine their own values.